A fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one important thing.
Welcome to the Spiritual Hedgehog podcast, where we explore the role philosophy and faith play in your daily life. Here are your hosts, Ira Gardner and Pastor Eric Dahl.
Want to talk with you today a little bit about place. And the reason I've been thinking about it, a number of reasons, and thinking about how I've changed in thinking about places like churches and synagogues and mosques and temples and all the places that speak of the divine, let alone when you talk about nature and you talk about being out in the wilderness and those things. And I had put one of those innocent, comments on Facebook, and my cousin wrote back and said, and took it a certain direction. I don't even remember what the quote was, but she wrote back and said, and talked about how she will never go to a church that worships in a church building. And so I started to think about that, and I used to sort of think along those lines. And her reason was the resources that go to a church building that could further go to the poor or the neglected, or all good reasons. But I wrote a response back to her saying, I think we need places that exemplify the divine, that magnify the divine, that give us a sense of the divine. And I compared it to, in a sense, the need for artwork. The need we have for beautiful places and beautiful things. And two stories, from my childhood sort of come to mind. And one is, and I think I've shared this one with you before, Ira, but sitting in the front, one of the front pews, my family was always early to church, or not always. With 4 kids, you were sometimes late to church walking in, but we'd always find a place within the first 3 or 4 pews of this big cathedral of a building, Central Lutheran in Minneapolis. And I remember I was probably 4 or 5 years old, and looking at my mom and dad, and does God live up there? And I kept pointing where they had this beautiful organ pipes and this cage, kind of the sense, and that was heaven to me. I was sure that God, in this, you'd look up and just be in awe of this huge cathedral, and God was somehow up there. And it stuck with me, even to the point where I kind of turned in an age, and there was part of me that didn't like church and didn't like that bigness and didn't like that wholeness. But I've come to believe that, there is a need, a place that, even if it is human made, God gives us the gifts to make beautiful things. And I started to wonder how we think about all that. And I'm curious, for instance, do you have those, step aside from nature for a second, because we both really relate to nature and being fishing, but are there places you go that speak of the divine to you?
Oh, without a doubt. First of all, I think architecture is probably the ultimate art form of illustrating what we're capable of through partnership, through community, and through a pursuit of aesthetic beauty and design. I think architecture is incredibly important to the spirit. And I think just if you drive through inner cities in places that the architecture is not, maybe it's the strip mall that's designed to be just very temporary, and that doesn't elevate the spirit the way a cathedral can, or a way a temple can, or a way an opera house can, if you will. So I'm a big, firm believer that our efforts to aspire towards the divine through place is a worthwhile endeavor. That said, I have taken as much spiritual pleasure in the small country one-room church as I have the Gothic cathedral. So it's not just about grandeur as much as it's, to me, it's also about creating a sense of community. And I was thinking about the fact that, when we go to a house of worship, we set aside all our status at the door, so to speak. Nobody's aware. When you're inside the door, you're not looking at the cars, you're not looking at the houses, you're not looking at all these social status, and you have this equality once you pass that threshold into that spiritual place, that it just kind of, for me, raises the spirit a little bit. And so I think that having a place of worship is a equalizing experience, if you will.
It's interesting. I think it may even be more important in our postmodern age to have places like that are set apart. There's an old adage. I was reading an article a while ago. I don't know, you probably know this quote. I hadn't, because it's from the early 60s, I think. Marshall McLuhan, the
Mm-hmm.
adage. Yep, I was guessing you might know this one. The medium is the message.
Yes, and the book cover was printed wrong, and they left the mistake because it came out as the medium is the massage.
That's great.
Yeah, it was a fun typo.
I did. Well, in the 60s, it would have been extra fun too, I bet. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the added, but it makes me think, the fact, worship spaces are different than office spaces. And I think like you said, like with a piece of art, I'm always curious where your like eye is drawn. For instance, both at the church I now serve at United Lutheran in Eugene, and then at St. Mark's, where you still attend when we're not in COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Is they have these, they're these A-frame, basically upside down ships, and it's not, and fish and fishermen and stuff. It's always for Jesus, and Christianity is a huge symbol. Fish, just with a letter off in the Greek being the word for Christ, also plays a role, but then also has that tying of community that, these were the Scandinavian, Norwegian, Swedes, Finns that had these, the fishing boats, and thinking about those examples of place. Or like I said, and so my eye is drawn, in an A-frame, it focuses your image up front, and thinking about community, and thinking about how that works, and pictures of God that come out of that, to a synagogue, for instance, right? The dome. I was trying to remember. First of all, not a synagogue. I'm thinking about a mosque right now. A mosque, which it's a place for prostration, for where you fall on your face, and knock over your microphone. No, you fall on your face in prayer, and the whole idea that they put that, they thought about things. They put it over the prayer room, the place of prayer, to help with the acoustics and the callings as those prayer meetings would happen. Often you'd see a star and a crescent, some five stars for the 5 pillars of Islam, and a crescent that again reminded people of the majesty of God and the bigness of God. Again, the dome, the universe, Allah in charge of the universe. There's intent, and there's intent, and you compare that. Now, I think, was it last time I was talking to you, when I was talking about the song I used to sing to my kids, Little Boxes on the Hillside,
Mm-hmm.
Little Boxes Made of Ticky-Tack, and I'm living in that sort of community now, and to love to be able to turn a corner and see a church there, that something different that allows my focus to think of something else, allows my focus to think of what is going on inside that space, what is different about what goes on in that space that might be going on in the homes. Not to say worship and things can't be going on in there. But in your photography, have you ever taken time to, I mean, obviously you've been in a lot of churches
Oh
doing
yeah,
weddings.
I've probably been in over 500 churches in my career.
Yes, I can imagine. Did any of them, I mean, as if I'm just to ask you the question right now, did any of those like stick out to you and strike you and make you think of the spiritual more than another place might?
Well, I will say one of the most sacred experiences I've ever had was participating in a mass at Notre Dame Cathedral. And the acoustics of the Gregorian chants and the chamber and the way sound travels through it, and of course the history that goes with that. It just creates a ambiance, a presence that is it was thrilling, absolutely thrilling. But then I've also, I'll tell you an interesting story. Years ago, I wanted to find out what was the difference between Christmas Eve services at a Catholic church, at Episcopalian, and at ended up going to a Calvinist church, all in one night. I went to 3 different church services in one night. And I went from everything from complete opulence to complete, very, very minimalist, if you will. And I found that I could have an equally powerful spiritual experience in all 3 of those places. I found that I was more comfortable with one over the other. There's some that did feel a little garish, if you will, in terms of how opulent. But I definitely could feel a powerful sense of spirit in all those places. And what I think about is, we look at, you talk about going through community and seeing churches. It causes, even just if it's not the church you go to, it causes you to think about what does it represent. And so when we think about spaces that become places of worship, they have a intrinsic value, which is their functionality, which is to gather people together in communion and prayer. They also have a symbolic quality of expressing an ideology and a belief system through architecture. What's interesting about this is you'll see differences between Protestant and Catholic churches, in that Protestant churches tend to use more abstract symbolism. They'll just show a cross, whereas you might have a 3-dimensional sculpture and realism be more prevalent in a Catholic church. In fact, that was something that was brought up by the poet William Carlos Williams. Talked about the difference of growing up in a Catholic church from a Protestant church. So the use of realism in depicting Jesus and the apostles, etc. And so you've got the symbolic, and then you also have something goes beyond the cultural value to the personal spiritual value. And I think churches have the opportunity to connect with us on all 3. I like to think that churches represent a safe haven. And in fact, as we have gone through some difficult times about immigration, many churches have stood up and been places of safe haven. I used to participate in Interfaith Hospitality Network, where churches would take turns putting homeless families up and helping them get back on their feet. So those places and those churches represent more than just the sum of the parts. The sum is greater than the parts.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Talking to my son Joel about this issue, I thought, I was kind of curious to get a young 20-something perspective on this after talking, after my cousins kind of back and forth a little bit. And he was saying, I think he was sort of leaning in what you're saying right there is the church, I think at its best is a sanctuary for people. But so often now, especially the great cathedrals and in some ways, understandably so, where they're locked, right? He said, what's the point of having a locked church? I mean, don't you totally defeat the purpose? And I said, oh yeah, it's fine. But when somebody comes and messes up your church, you got to at least have somebody in the community that says, yeah, it's worth it to have it open. We'll help clean it up, or else that pastor's gonna be stuck doing a lot of cleanup. I was just joking, but so but I loved his idealism of saying, isn't that the hope that you know every church should be a place for the homeless, or for a safe place. Unfortunately, we do want to protect those places too, just like you want to protect fine art. So it's just an interesting tension where I think you have to kind of look at both sides of the issue to try to figure that out. I mean, do you think churches should be open? I mean,
I do. And it's funny, I really appreciate that your son brought that up, because I had a similar experience the first time I went to the East Coast, and I spent time in Maine and Vermont. And, it was this idyllic New England setting, and it brought back, and you'd see all these church steeples, and it made me think of the whole thing about, here's the church, here's the steeple, open door, all the people, right? And I kept going up to these churches wanting to take a look inside, and I kept coming up, doors locked, doors locked. I'm like, gee, is God not at home today? And so I understand the difficulties we have. There's been an interesting progression. Many churches, as did many colleges, would have a residence on the property for the pastor to live in. And so there was always somebody home. There was always a caretaker. There was all these sorts of things that allowed for churches to be open. But I think the modern economy has made it very difficult for many churches to be able to keep their doors open 24/7. And so I understand it, but I do like to think that churches would be places to be open.
And how do we work towards that? I think is some of my thinking. So this church that I told you that I grew up in Minneapolis, I remember I had some friends and I wanted to go take them, to this place I'd grown up, proud of this, this church, and walked in and immediately got the 5th degree by a custodian, and nope, the sanctuary is locked today. We can't allow you to go in there. We don't have anyone to take you through it. And this is my home church. What do you mean I can't walk through it? How can this be? And I had a strong, just visceral reaction. And yet I can understand too, the older we get and the less we can take care of stuff, I think you tend to, you want to protect your space. And yet everything about me in my faith says we need to open these spaces up. And how do we do that? And maybe that's right. Maybe we need to return to that time, or maybe we will return to that time as the economy changes again, where somebody will be in place, in space, to allow a more openness to these places. But trying to come up with terms to do that, it's interesting.
Well, I think, every church has an opportunity to solve that problem. Museums have volunteers that are docents. You look at botanical gardens that may not have paid staff to be able to keep gardens open to the public. They have volunteer positions. These are interesting challenges that can be addressed if that becomes a pain point for that community that says, hey, we're not able to keep our facilities open as much as we'd like to. But then there's other places where if there's not a neighborhood around a church that people can walk to, then there's probably less likely to be a need for it to be open in the same way that a church that's maybe in a community space where there's a lot of people that might be able to walk to it. What's interesting to me in terms of churches and spaces is watching the changeover in historic downtown church locations, and also watching the repurposing of spaces such as old movie theaters, and the rise of the mega church, if you will. And all these environments serve different needs of the spirit. And what's, one of the things I appreciate about Paul in the Bible, it talks about, what might be a sin for you may not be for me, and vice versa. And I tend to think about, why do we need so many different denominations? Why do we need so many different approaches to Christianity, in particular, or Islam and Jewish faith? I mean, there's all kinds of variations, but I think the purpose of having all these different approaches and all these different buildings, spaces, is that everybody has something they need different. They need to find what works for them in their spiritual practice. And so there are some people that really value utilitarian, and they want to be more outward mission focused, and therefore they're bothered by something that feels too ornate, and they want to find something simpler. The diversity of church spaces and denominations is a reflection of the diversity of the human spirit and the needs that need to be met.
Right. So yeah, no, that's just a very concrete example, of that, of whether you're talking about the difference between Eastern Orthodox Christianity to early Protestant, especially Calvinism, the pilgrims that came over, or if you're talking about Islam. There's this tension as, Islam won't have any statues in their mosques, because they want to keep the risk of idolatry down, right? Too many things, and yet you walk into an Eastern Orthodox church, and you are going to see statues, or you're going to see just lost the picture with the window,
the stained glass, the Stations of the Cross.
Icons, icons is the word I was looking for, all over the place. The difference between having a crucifix and just the cross. And I like your turn to say, maybe we need that breadth to understand that people need to express their spirituality in different ways, and one thing may draw one person and another, just like my cousin, who was drawn to say, really want my resources to be going out into the community, and I can find my community in a church that's meeting at a school just as well as I could going to a church. Where for me, while I had my time where it was more like that, there is still something that I like about a church, that has some symbols in there that can help me reflect on my faith and reflect on the story, for me as a Christian, of Jesus. And those tangent symbols are important to me, and they, my view of Jesus was shaped in some ways by the ascension scene at St. Mark's. That's the really a Mideastern looking Jesus rising into the heavens, and thinking about, that changes the way people think of their faith. Suddenly it's not a Jesus just reflecting me. Those things to me do have an impact, and having a place for art. But as we said, kind of the protection is, how do we not allow those things to turn into museums? So if you go to Europe and you go to some of the churches You might see 10, 20 people, and the state is paying for the churches these days. How do we be creative about those spaces that still offer a window to the divine, but is it just, are they doomed to be museums now, and have we, or will they be reclaimed someday? It's a tension
Well,
I'm
I
not.
think museums are pretty sacred spaces. So
So they're not. It's not a negative word to you. I understand. Yeah, yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, culture changes over time and it goes through phases, trends, if you will. There's been a trend in churches over the last 20 years to try to implement a lot of multimedia and look for spaces that have more performative qualities to it, maybe a stage, electric guitar instead of a pipe organ, so to speak. But I also think that those things are cyclical depending upon where our culture is at a particular time, where our country is, if you will. If we're going through a period of a lot of fear and anxiety, we tend to want to go back to what feels traditional, older, and then when we're feeling vibrant and we want to chart new territory, we tend to want to move to a style of worship that's maybe more what we think is contemporary or cutting edge. And I think the challenge for churches is to figure out who they are and remain consistent enough that they become a beacon for that particular need, and be okay with the fact that there will be ebbs and flows and participation based upon the ebbs and flows in people's lives, which is one of the things I've loved about St. Mark's, is they've always honored that. I always love the fact that once you've been baptized in, once you've been accepted into it, you're going to get a newsletter from us no matter what. you're always a member, so to speak.
Yeah, that's right. Can't get rid of it. Yeah, yeah. No, that's yeah, so interesting. I'll never forget. I think it was when Rabbi Jack Isaacson came to St. Mark's to give a message, and we were talking. Well, wanted to say, do we take out certain, prayers? How do we be respectful? And he said no. He said, you worship the way you worship, and that identifies with who you are and as a community. And I come in as a person into this midst and share with you my story, not expecting you to be someone else, but to come and broaden your perspective because you've invited me in. Just like my perspective will be broadened as I step into your space that is holy to you, and hear how you express yourselves. And it adds conversation. And I thought it was just sort of a sweet way to say, you do you as well as you can, and I will do me, and we will have conversation and learn from one another, and then we'll end up taking part of you. We will become a bigger community because of it. So the same thing goes, right? How pastors have a tendency to be competitive from time to time. I don't know if you ever knew that, Ira, but that can happen. And in the midst of that competitiveness, right, mainline traditions have been taking it pretty hard because our numbers aren't maybe what some of the mega churches are. But I think what I've come to understand is we've got to understand who we are and then do it to proclaim that message to the best we can without having to feel judgmental about, as you said, some people are really looking for something different in their spirituality, and how do they access and come to understand God. The tension that we need to continue to play with is we tend to get into those places and we stop talking to one another. We become too myopic in our views. How do we continue to say to one another without being threatened by it, tell me about why you worship the way you do, and how you worship the way you do, and how God is speaking to you in this place, how the Spirit is speaking to you in this place. And I think the less threatened and to think that we have to somehow defend God, and as if God is not able to defend God's self in the midst of these things. And less threatened we can be to open our ears. We might just hear God speaking through those people that see things differently than us. And how do we better do
Well, so what you just said there about God not feeling threatened, I think ultimately is a segue to what each of us as individuals are aspiring towards, which is to a level of authentic self that doesn't feel threatened or defensive about who we are. And it's interesting. You brought up Marshall McLuhan's famous line about the medium is the message. What's interesting about that is that book was really looking at and giving us a preview of this idea of a global world, that we would have this communication technology would allow us to create a global cultural experience. And with the idea that would expand understanding, it would expand appreciation, and we're coming just out of the modernism too into postmodernism, but this idea of we could appreciate cultural differences, and we had cultural studies come about. Stuart Hall started looking at cultural studies. What I find really interesting is we need more literacy to understand that we have an opportunity to participate and share our unique qualities with the world. But if we're not careful, if we don't have that confidence of just this is who we are, this is how we do it, there's a flattening out of culture that happens through a seeking external validation. You see it in social media, the idea of literally, if I were to worry about whether people liked my photography or not, I would make my photos pretty much limited to kittens, sunsets, and selfies, right? Because that's what's popular. And you can see that with this new medium arising right now. TikTok's the big video, and you see trends in that. But the flip side of that, so that's kind of the flattening out of culture, the homogenization of culture. The flip side of that, though, is what we call the long tail, which is that there's an opportunity to appreciate and present culture, authentic culture from all over the world. And we have an opportunity to access that. And there are groups of people that are able to fundraise and find support for their community just by virtue of being consistent with who they are. And I think about some of the work I did with Maasai tribe from Kenya that were traveling around the world, and they were basically sharing their music, their stories in art, and some of their jewelry, with an effort of how can we, there's value in just bringing who we are into the world. And I think media technology allows us to appreciate, but it also requires a greater fortitude of, okay, this is the culture, the subculture of spirituality that I belong to, that I've chosen to participate in, and this is the space that we've created for that. And I think if we can just be consistent, we can establish authenticity through that. I think trying to always change to go with the latest trend could be challenging.
Yeah, totally agree with you. And it is our tendency, right? And talking about getting whiplash as quickly as things are changing these days, it really could lead to a very unsettled feeling just in our day-to-day lives. So, how do we allow ourselves to settle in, spend time in the sacred, however and wherever that is taking, and trust that that other people are doing the same thing. So
Well, so one of the things that came to mind as we started this conversation about the role the church facility plays in spiritual life, the role that space plays in spiritual life, um, does make me think of three things. One is the ritual aspect of going to worship, which creates this taking me out of my day-to-day struggles, day-to-day labor, and to say, okay, for this period of time, I'm going to go to this place and I'm going to leave all that behind to be able to enrich my spirit. And you know, for many people, they will do that going to the gym to work out, so to speak. We go to place to get something that we need in our life, and so I think church can fulfill that role if we find the right fit for us. But then the other thing I think about is, even within my home, I've tried to create spaces for prayer. Whether it's a meditation space, if you will, whether it's I remember a number of years ago, I set up a writing table just to be able to journal, reflect, and pray. And I had this book about how to write your own psalms, if you will. And it was an interesting faith practice at that time, but it required creating a space for that to happen. And I think about the fact that we can recreate in miniature, so to speak, some of the nuances of church in private spaces in our home. Maybe it's a candle, maybe it's a cross or a crucifixion, maybe it's just a place to
like a
pray, a
like
meditation.
a redo, or there's different places. It's to me, what you're talking about is we need places that are set apart
Yeah.
for different things, for different activities. It's why I can work out at home. I can. I'm more effective if I have some place to go to work out. I can, and I will pray in my bed as I'm falling asleep. But if I have a physical place that I can go to in my house that says this is my place of prayer for in my house, I can set that aside. It becomes a place set apart.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in this homogenous, desire to have everybody think and do and be the same, having those places set apart to say this is for a different time, a different aspect of my life. It doesn't mean they can't be blended either. I mean, I think of retreat spaces, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about God's wilderness is a place set apart. I mean, sometimes I love the fact that there are camps to go to that are out, and I'll offer outdoor experiences, because going to camp as a kid, for many people is this important aspect, and they want to find a way to bring that back. I think we get to a point where once we can relax more to say, no, it's good to have places set apart that give us a different experience too. It's not such a bad thing. We want to capture that, but we don't always have to. It's okay to let that be that experience out there. And when I come back, yes, this is maybe my workspace, and things will get blended, but it is, to me, nice to have those spiritual places that we can set apart or go to that are set apart.
We need passageways, doorways to cross a threshold, even if it's just some symbolic. I mean, I remember there used to be a TV show back when I was a kid, WKRP in Cincinnati, and the news director for this little AM radio station wanted an office so bad that he finally taped off the space for an office. And even though the walls weren't there, he wanted to honor the fact that he needed that private space within that confine. And I think we all need that private space in our heart, in our mind, for where we can self-reflect and pause, but also within our three-dimensional world of being able to enter into a space that has a particular purpose for feeding our spirit. And gardeners understand that. Garden design, the idea of creating a room experience as you go into a garden space. I think about, for me, going on a hiking trail oftentimes is to enter into my favorite cathedral, if you will, is to commune with nature and God. But I've created little meditation spaces in my landscaping that allows me to do that. One of the things I loved about St. Mark's is if you walk around the grounds and you see a little sculpture embedded into the greenery, and it just is like these little pauses for reflection. And so we can create some of that space in our homes, and then we can have something where we share it more publicly and more communally in our church environment.
Absolutely. Yeah, and thanks for bringing those things up. It also reminds me of a labyrinth. For men spiritually, often a place to go to is, I need to be able to do something active that's also going to connect me to God or connect me. And so those different labyrinths, they have a couple at St. John's Episcopal Cathedral, or, different ones that have been set apart.
They just put one in to honor one of my former colleagues at the college, Doc Polly, as a memorial, and it's a beautiful memorial. I look forward to visiting that.
Absolutely. Good. Well, Ira, I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, me too, my friend.
And well, keep thinking about this question, and thanks for reminding me that we don't all have to come to the same answer on this, that God's Spirit can work to each of us in different ways. So thanks.
Amen. All right, we'll see you next time.
Sounds great.
Thank you for joining us today on The Spiritual Hedgehog. For show notes and more information, go to www.thespiritualhedgehog.com.